Hello, I'm Michael Denon, Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning and Dean of the Division of Undergraduate Education here at UC Irvine. And this is Conversations with the Vice Provost, where I sit down with colleagues and I talk about topics of interest to the campus, the state, the country, dare I say, even the world. And it is a great pleasure to have with me today Professor and Director of Lifted, Keramet Reiter. Welcome, Keramet.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
So we'll just jump right in. Very briefly, for those who may not be aware, maybe tell us a few things about the Lifted program, but also I'm just really excited about it, as you can tell. I know you know I'm excited about it. Like, why? Like, this is super cool. How did it get started?
So Lifted is the first University of California bachelor's degree for incarcerated students. So that's really cool. It's at UC Irvine. We're working on replicating, but right now we have 44 students who are enrolled at a prison in San Diego. They take classes on site at the prison. So UC Irvine faculty go down and teach in person 4 days a week, seminar style. We have two cohorts, and our first cohort will graduate in June of 2024. They enter as junior level transfer students. So that's the basics of the program.
Right.
It's just a bachelor's degree. It happens to be for incarcerated students who were eligible. They were taking community college classes, and they met the transfer admissions to the UCs just like any other transfer student. And that kind of gets to the why of the program, which is that California about 10 years ago started investing in education for incarcerated students. And the thinking was, our prison system in this state is astronomically expensive, and it's kind of a failure. Like 2/3 of people go back to prison after 3 years out, and those are pretty embarrassing statistics, especially when you're spending $100,000 per person per year to keep them in prison. And so I think the legislature kind of was looking at those numbers. Yeah. Prison reform was really a part of the conversation in the state. And one thing that we know works is education. So when students get a college degree, their recidivism rates start approaching zero, down from like 60, 70%, right? I mean, these are like statistics you don't see. Yeah. So the legislature said, well, let's start with the community colleges. California has this amazing system of higher education. Can we incentivize community colleges to go into the prisons? And they did. They basically said, if you offer credits in prison, we'll make it slightly more valuable than offering credits out of prison. The community colleges rushed in. Within a few years, each of the 34 prisons in the state had community college programming, most of it face-to-face.
Oh, wow.
And then the next step was, then all of a sudden they had thousands of people clamoring for bachelor's degrees. Right. And that's when Cal State LA started the first bachelor's program, but that's around the time UC Irvine, having a Department of Criminology, with a lot of folks like me who had been thinking about the prison system in the state for years, started thinking about, oh, this is really interesting, there's an exciting opportunity here. So it took about 5 years to plan to get the program off the ground, but that was the motivation, was kind of watching and saying, oh,
so I gotta say two things to that. One little personal story, which I can't remember if I shared with you. I know I haven't shared with the audience yet, but this was years ago, driving around Irvine, and somehow it came up that was about the point we started spending more money on prisons than education.
Yes. Yeah.
And my younger daughter at the time, maybe around 12, after a little bit of back and forth, just looked at me and goes, "Daddy, don't adults know that if you educate people, they probably won't go to prison?" So there was that sort of moment of, realization of my child's part that maybe not everything works well in the adult world. But that aside,
those intuitions are so valuable.
The other thing, and this is a little, I think, in the weeds maybe for some people, but I think exciting a bit to the university community. You mentioned it took 5 years to get this going. I know that probably felt like a very long time while you're in the middle of it. That seems very short to me now as an administrator, because I think what people have to understand is I know you're leveraging an existing degree, but you're basically getting a degree program off the ground, and a whole new thing. And you have to deal with all of the logistics of, you said it, students are admitted, they have to apply, they have to qualify. So I think for people to really understand, that's not easy to do everything that you've did. Maybe comment a little bit on that process and what it was really like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I had no idea what I was getting into. I had been involved in prison education since I was in college, and so I had a sense of, and I do research on prisons, so I had a sense of what I was dealing with the prison system. I think I had no idea what I was dealing with the University of California until I was deeply in it, with a group of just incredible colleagues, many much more senior who had senior administrative positions,
Right.
which I think was key because, as you suggest, we had to work with basically every office on campus to make this happen. Admissions, financial aid. I've learned so much about the transfer process in the state, and it's one of the things I think is exciting about these programs is I'm in a monthly call with community colleges, Cal States, UCs, all together working to figure out how to get incarcerated students in the state into the best college program for them. And that's so cool. Like, that's not happening in other parts of the state in the same way, I think. So I've gotten to know not just my UC colleagues, but my higher ed colleagues across the state in a fun way. But yeah, working within UC Irvine, even, figuring out what the transfer process is like, working really closely with admissions to figure out how to help students who don't have access to the internet submit applications. We actually just this year with our third cohort were able to get the website accessible to them for a week so they could submit their own applications. But I think it's also representative of how at first it feels overwhelming, but each year of the program it feels like we're building more infrastructure.
Yes.
That's really sustainable and exciting to incorporate these students more into our community.
And I think a useful thing, you alluded to it, like once they can, say, apply online to UCI for a week as other campuses roll out programs, that's basically the same infrastructure, because that's about being in the prison, not
Exactly.
at a given campus. Exactly. And I think something that this always comes up when people talk to me, first of all, they don't realize I have nothing to do with admissions. So I get a lot of questions. My title looks like I might. I don't, and that's really nice.
Yes.
But I think there's this weird sense people have about their spots, and spots get taken by different groups. Yeah. And it's really hard to explain to people sometimes that that's not really quite how it works.
Yeah.
And I do think it's worth just emphasizing, again, you've said it, I've said it, but I want to really drive home. These students, there's not like they're getting a spot or they're taking a spot, and it's not like it's an easy way in. You have to get your community college degree. You have to do all of that work like anyone else. You have to qualify, you have to apply, you have to be accepted. I just got to ask, I assume you get a little bit of questions around that area at various times, or mostly do they get it in this space? Or is that hard to say?
I think there are questions. I have to say, when we started talking about this, people said, oh my gosh, you're going to get so much pushback. And mostly what I get is questions about whether we get pushback and not a lot of pushback.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, which is great. But I do think understanding, like, I didn't understand the transfer process before we started. I think first of all, the community colleges were already operating, so we
Right.
didn't need to offer freshman and sophomore level classes. But I think all of us working in this space also felt like it was really important that they be junior level transfer students. So we weren't pushing out freshmen,
Right.
because that would be a really different thing where there's a set number of
Right.
students you're working with. And we are saying we're replacing one freshman from a state high school with a freshman from a state
Right.
prison. What we're doing is saying there are transfer pathways in this state that are open to everyone, that if you complete certain requirements, you are eligible for UC
Yeah.
admission, and we're leveraging that. And so I think we flip the conversation and say, these are students who were always eligible, who we were excluding with no reason.
Yes.
A few years ago, the UCs banned the box, meaning that they stopped asking about criminal records on applications. So it's actually illegal to not include incarcerated students, because as of that, they're explicitly eligible. And so I think it's, one way to look at it is the glass half empty, we're pushing people out, but the glass half full is there are thousands of people in this state who we've been excluding without justification from UC degrees, and when they get those degrees, they do really well.
Yeah.
Or we hope we're going to show that, but evidence about prior college programming.
And I think actually, it's funny when you do things like this, there's these sort of unintended positive side effects. I don't know how many people realize how great our community college and transfer system is in the state. Like, I grew up in Connecticut where that wasn't a thing, really.
Yeah.
Right? I think more native Californians understand it than those of us who are transplants like me. But I still think, it's an awesome system. Like you said, anyone can go to the community college. And once you're there, if you meet the degrees, there's all sorts of guarantees to getting into UC for anyone who does it. And that's awesome about our state.
And the thing I never understood is there's incredible financial support behind it, also particularly in the UCs.
Right.
So when we started this, we were leveraging Blue and Gold, which is scholarship support
Right.
for students whose family income is under $80,000, which means that if you apply from the community college and you come from a family that's eligible, your UC tuition will be covered, which is something I end up saying in the prisons all the time because correctional officers say to me, I couldn't afford a UC education, and I say, actually, that's a misunderstanding. You could and you should, right? So I think that's another exciting piece of this. Again, is leveraging these existing policies that maybe people don't understand as well as they should.
So free advertising for everyone.
Yes.
That's our public service.
Yes.
Now I want to switch gears slightly. You mentioned this in the very beginning. I think it's an exciting statistic, and it's something. I am a physics professor. I don't study the prison system, but it fascinates me. I think it fascinates many people. And this idea of recidivism, but also, there really just seems to be this deep, I don't know if it's in this country or human nature, right? This deep tension between this desire for punishment and the need for some sort of restorative justice, making sure there isn't recidivism. It's like in our best interest that people don't end up going back to prison. I think that's pretty obvious. It's got all sorts of positive benefits. But I do think sometimes people struggle with it. Maybe even independent of this, since this is your area, maybe touch a little bit on what we do know about that for people, just to give some background, and then we can talk about how lifted comes into it.
Yeah, you mean how people do with education or...
Well, yeah, just like what do we know about the things that help with restorative justice and avoiding recidivism, and how do we help people move away from it's just about punishment and really embrace that people do change, people, I don't know, there's positive outcomes here.
Yeah. I think there's a tendency sometimes to think we don't understand that much or know that much about the prison system, and I think a better way to reframe it is, and a lot of my work is about like all the things we don't know.
By the way, feel free to change any question I ask to a question you want to answer.
But I think we do know an immense amount about what helps people succeed, right? Like it's not actually rocket science or physics. We know that when we give people an education, the better education they have, the better their life outcomes are. We know that when people have access to meeting their basic needs, they do better. And I think sometimes we fail to apply that knowledge to the prison system. So we get caught up in this idea of you did something wrong and so we have to punish you, and we have to punish you a lot to kind of make ourselves feel better and to show that this isn't acceptable to society. But we kind of lose sight of the fact that even when someone does something wrong, we kind of know what it takes to help them out, and we often don't make those investments because they're politically unpopular. And so I think, what we know is just as outside of society where people who get an education and a college degree tend to be healthier, have better incomes over their lifetime, it's the same if you're incarcerated. If we can get you basic health care also, right? To the extent we can take care of you and meet your basic needs, make sure you have enough food, you have enough health care, but also get you an education that you will do better. So, and there are really interesting questions, as social scientists, there are interesting questions about this. Do people go to college? Are the people who are going to college and prison just more predisposed to succeed anyway? But what's so cool about what's happening in California is we're talking about thousands of people, tens of thousands of people having access to a college education, and we're talking about such drastic, right? We usually see the kinds of statistics where you go from a 50% or more recidivism rate to something around zero, where the one or two people who don't succeed. So those kinds of numbers are really exciting, and what California is doing is really exciting because it's happening not on a, for a long time in the U.S., the college programs in prisons were like little liberal arts programs where 3 or 4 people a year graduated. And what California is doing is saying, no, we're incorporating this into the system of public education, and we're incorporating thousands of students and showing similar success rates over the last 10 years. So those are, does that kind of answer the question about how we think about resources?
And it definitely does. And I'm just curious, if there's, I look at it, and you mentioned something, there's sort of like this political view, and definitely, I moved out to California, I've been through like 3 strikes getting passed, and just sort of an increase in spending. And what I find really fascinating about humans is we don't always do the math, right? I do a fun little exercise in one of my GE courses where I have people estimate, what might it cost to run like a K through 12 or a college system, and it's not that bad. It's hard to get it below 7,000 a student, but I tried to do the same thing for what would it cost to run a prison system. And one, I realized I don't know nearly enough to estimate it, but it seemed like at the end of the day it was probably going to be more because there's just more stuff around and people cost money and you need more people to run it.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like we like to go against we're so interested in punishment, we actually go against our own best interest. Is that something that's you find you can articulate to people when you're talking about it, or how does that dynamic kind of work in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's lucky to be in this state at this time, right? Because I think there is a growing sense that this is true, that our punishment practices have worked against our own best interests, in part as a result of really high-profile litigation in the state challenging things like one prisoner a day dying unnecessarily from lack of health care.
Right.
Which is a horrifying statistic. One prisoner a week, about 10 years ago. It's a horrifying statistic. It also resulted in a massive investment in healthcare for incarcerated people in the state that raised the price per person even further, right? And I think that very public conversation actually was really generative for saying punishment isn't working. But I think some of it also is there's a tendency in the United States to think that we have to not just punish you by taking your liberty away and sending you to prison, but make sure that you're feeling punished the entire time you're there. Partly as a result of social inequality, I think, right? Like the thing I mentioned where correctional officers say to me, I didn't have this opportunity, is really poignant. Because there is a lot of social inequality where a lot of people feel like they can't afford to send their kid to the UC.
Right.
And I think that's where a lot of this friction comes in. And it's why it's so important to talk about things like blue and gold, right? Where like you actually can, and some of it is a misunderstanding of what options are available. But to the extent it's really true that there are these inequalities, it does feel unfair. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. The problem is that making it more unfair or worse for some people actually makes it worse for everyone, right? Because then we're dealing with the recidivism and the increased crime. So I think it's that sense of if we can raise the resources, right? Like it's not just about making education available to incarcerated students. It's about making sure everybody knows that there are these pathways into the UCs that really support a diverse population. And I see working with incarcerated students as one way to really leverage those, bring attention to them, bring those resources to a broader set of communities that always should have had access to them.
It's really fascinating because in a very small microcosm, and I don't mean this at all to kind of trivialize it, I think it's an analogy. I find we sometimes maybe do that to some of our students where, we sort of have this goal that everybody learns the stuff by the end of the course. But a lot of grading is designed where if you don't get good scores at the beginning, we have to make sure we hold that against you at the end, or somehow it wasn't fair to the students who learned it at the beginning.
Yeah.
And yet, really all we want is you all to learn it at the end. And so there's this human tension between what we view as fair versus making sure we can maximize outcomes for everyone does come up in a lot of places.
It's part of why prisons are so interesting, right? Like your instinct that they're interesting to, I certainly studying them, but like I've always said that they're like a magnifying lens on so many social problems, right? And how we think about inequality and punishment are actually part of our daily lives, especially in education, right? And like we can see much more clearly in prison how these experiments play out.
That's interesting. So final sort of big topic, this is a natural lead into it. Obviously in recent years, I think implicit bias has become a much bigger thing. People have gotten unconscious bias, implicit, however you want to call it, has been on more people's radar. Even our explicit biases have, a lot during the pandemic came out to do this. This must be an area that you have to deal with regularly in this program. Clearly, we have a lot of very dedicated faculty who are, I think, committed to this and don't. Maybe the implicit biases you still have to fight because by definition you don't know they're there, but at least the explicit biases less so. But I want to kind of take this in a positive path. Like this seems to be a space that allows us to start, sort of getting more people to know this population, getting integrated with this population, and that may be part of what helps us with this, fairness thing we just discussed. How has that been playing out in, the full whole 2 years that we've been running the program?
But To my surprise, it's been playing out dramatically already.
Okay.
And it's one of the things that's really exciting to me about it, right? And sometimes I have to stop and remind, like, obviously part of the goal of this program is to bring a college degree to students. But right now we're serving 44 students. That is nothing in the scheme of the UC system, right? Like, those students are very important. They're our first students. I'm really excited for them to graduate. But they're like a teeny drop in the bucket. And I think the program is doing something much bigger and much more important. And it's what you're suggesting, right? It's taking these massive state institutions, the prison system that has more than 100,000 people, the tens of thousands of people in the UCs, and having them talk to each other in ways that really change their perspectives. I think, interestingly, in both ways. I mean, the one that you're raising is this idea of how we think about incarcerated students. And the reason I'm involved in this at its root is that I think that our criminal legal system is unfair and expensive and messes a lot of things up.
Right.
And I think that one of the most important ways we can change that is change our perspectives about who's inside. And I think the best way to do that is to just see them as human beings. And that's what this program does, right? And it's not just like our first few faculty maybe were faculty who were interested in prisons or had taught in prison programs elsewhere. But we now have dozens of faculty who've gone into the prison to work with these students, many of them who never thought about teaching in prison before. They just saw the call and said, that sounds interesting. I'm curious to teach a seminar to 25 students in prison. I've never done anything like that. And then they come out and they say, oh my goodness, these are some of the most amazing students I've ever worked with. They have these fascinating life experiences. It's not what I imagined at all. The question I do get every quarter from faculty is, should I be scared? Am I going to be safe? What do I need to do to take care of myself? And I say, I cannot imagine a place where you will feel safer. The drive down to the prison is more dangerous than being inside. Because even if one person had a bad day or got in a fight, everyone else values this program so much that you'd have 30 guys surrounding you, protecting you. And I think that, and what I'm seeing now is faculty, like at our last advisory committee meeting, we had like 50 faculty, and they're so passionate about the criminal legal system. Right? All of a sudden, they're asking me, what do I read? How do I think about it? Where do I go to think about different policies? How can we change perception? So I think that is one really exciting piece, is just seeing these folks in prison in a completely different way. And I think that's the start to thinking differently about punishment, thinking differently about how the state invests. And it's not just the faculty, right? It's that now we have these students coming to campus. They're getting out, they're matriculating on campus. And I have students coming to me saying, I just sat next to this guy in class who came out of Lifted, and he's just like, he's really interesting. He's had an interesting life experience. In criminology, he knows so much about the criminal legal system, and he's not what I expected at all, right? And now we have more students flocking to Underground Scholars that supports formerly incarcerated students. So it's really, I think, growing the community of people who think differently and don't come with the same set of stigmatized assumptions to these interactions. And it's a slow process, but it's a really exciting one.
That is super. Now, again, totally not meaning to trivialize anything, because it's always a danger in this question. Do you think the incarcerated students are changing some of their views of professors? Because we're a weird group.
I do. I mean, and they're finally, right, like every quarter they're asking, like, what is this person doing? Why is this one different from this one? I'm like, every professor is different, right? And we're really trying, we always say we want them to have as similar as possible an experience as they would have on campus. So they have a range of faculty, majority full-time faculty, a few lecturers, a few graduate students. So they're really getting this range of experiences. And yeah, I think now those who've been in the program for 2 years are just like, they see the huge variety and see people as accessible. And
Well, that is something I think is always often a challenge for some of our students who come here, particularly from certain cultural backgrounds. We are not accessible. We're the faculty. We're somehow special. And humanizing us is, I think, part of our goals at UCI with our students. So I would imagine there's a similar dynamic there. So it's kind of cool to see that.
And it's been fun, right? I mean, I'm in a lot of spaces with community colleges, Cal States, the prison system, where people kind of assume the UCs are going to be elitist. And it's also really nice to be team players in these spaces, right? I think the students and all those administrators from these other institutions are starting to see us as just a real colleague in this space where we all have the same goals of extending educational opportunities. And that's really cool too, right? To kind of break down those assumptions.
How much, I mean, there's a lot of interactions going on here, and you've mentioned talking about how much do faculty even like interact, say, with the prison staff, and is there exchanges there that are, perhaps changing things and leading to new ideas, or is that less so?
I hope so. I mean,
Yeah.
they do have to have a fair amount of interaction to get into the prison. I mean, you'll find out when you come to graduation, but when to get into the prison, you have to go past a guardhouse, past a security checkpoint to get into the facility, past another checkpoint to get into the actual yard where the prison is, and past a fourth checkpoint to get into the classroom. And so they're interacting every week with the same set of officers at each of those checkpoints. And yeah, I think some people just say hi, but some people really have conversations with them. And it is, I think, again, just those like person to person, right? As we come back into the real world and off Zoom, those person to person interactions, I think, really are part of how we change the cultural assumptions that everybody's bringing to these.
No, I think that's great. And I think there's so many cases that we can look at where it is just the human interaction of groups that normally wouldn't talk to each other, talking to each other, and then we make progress. Yeah. Well, this is exciting, Keramet. I just have to say, I mean, I hope you all and the whole team that works with you, because we all know it's not just one person, and you've said that already.
It is so many people, including
team.
you.
Well, thank you. And I do like, for all of you who did not hear your name mentioned, you know, I tend to have a policy I learned from my advisor. If I start trying to mention names, I miss someone. But anyone can go to our lifted websites, our lifted information, and find out about the great team,
takes a village.
who they all are, because there really was a lot that went into this. It's an amazing program. Thank you for your time. It's been great chatting.
Thanks for your support.
And thank you all for watching and listening to. This has been another Conversations with the Vice Provost. And I just have to say, if you're here for this and you're at my website, I'm going to do a self-advertising here. You should check out the other channel, Physics of X, where X is everything except politics. So because it's not politics, the lifted program won't end up on that channel, but you can enjoy a lot of cool conversations there as well. So thank you, and until next time, this has been Michael Denon.